You think rent is high now? Well, brace yourself, because the worst may be yet to come. Why? Because forces beyond your control are already at work to make rent even less affordable. And unless you understand what's happening, well, you could be in for a rude shock. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal exactly why rents are about to skyrocket even further and what you can do to avoid being crushed by this rising tide. Around 60% of Americans are renters, transforming the United States into a renter's nation, as some real estate experts describe it. The cost of renting has skyrocketed, especially since the onset of the pandemic, and this trend shows no signs of stopping. In major cities across the U.S., from the tech hubs of San Francisco to the densely populated streets of New York, and all points in between, millions are finding themselves increasingly stretched to meet their rent payments. Now, rising rents are creating an affordability crisis that's squeezing renters across the board, says Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's Analytics. Data underscores the crisis. In 2023, that year recorded an all-time high of 22.4 million households struggling with unaffordable rents, according to a report released by the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. Now, their findings showed that rent has now become one of the most pressing financial challenges for Americans. Today, most renters are spending between 30% and 50% of their total income just on housing. According to federal guidelines, households that spend more than 30% of their income on rent are classified as moderately rent-burdened, while those surpassing 50% are deemed severely rent-burdened. This metric speaks volumes about the financial strain engulfing the nation, as housing costs consume more of people's wages than ever before. Now, the Harvard study highlights that by 2023, nearly half of all renters were exceeding the 30% threshold. The U.S. rental market has reached a critical point where housing costs are outpacing what average families can afford, said Chris Herbert, the study's lead researcher. In September 2024, typical asking rents reached a new high of $2,050. That's according to Zillow's latest data, with the U.S. Census Bureau noting this month-over-month rise as the most substantial in over a decade. This trend has been compounding month after month, hitting renters particularly hard. September also brought a new benchmark. Real median gross rent costs spiked by 3.8%, sharply higher than the historical annual average of 1.8%. Now, according to the census, this 3.8% increase marks the largest annual jump in rental costs since 2011, signaling that the affordability crisis is not only persisting, but it's accelerating. Rent prices are pushing people to make difficult financial choices, whether to pay rent, buy groceries, or cover basic health costs, explains Diane Yentl, president of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're seeing more people fall into housing insecurity as a result. To afford the current average rent without being classified as rent-burdened, renters would now need to make 36% more than they did before COVID. Zillow's research reveals that a prospective tenant must earn at least $79,889 annually to avoid spending more than 30% of their income on rent. Now, that's an increase of $21,197 from 2019. For many, this income requirement is simply out of reach, as wage growth continues to lag far behind rising rents. Now, this isn't just an issue of supply and demand. Oh no. Experts warn that broader economic forces are also pushing rents to unprecedented heights as well. High interest rates have driven up mortgage costs, discouraging potential homebuyers and increasing demand in that rental market. In turn, landlords are capitalizing on this by raising rents at record rates. The combination of high interest rates and inflation is creating a perfect storm in the rental market, explains Lawrence Young, chief economist for the National Association of Realtors. As it stands, renters should brace themselves for more painful increases in the months to come. So, what's driving this relentless rise in rent prices, and why should you be genuinely alarmed right now? Well, rent prices have surged dramatically in recent years due to a mix of powerful factors. Here's how these forces are impacting renters across the country. Ready? First, inflation. Look, we're all feeling the squeeze, aren't we, as inflation drives up costs across the board, from groceries to utilities. But here's the catch. As living expenses rise, landlords are also raising rents to cover their own mounting costs. Whether it's paying higher wages for maintenance staff, covering increased repair expenses, or simply keeping up with property taxes that have surged in parallel with home prices. And of course, as rent prices climb, that pushes inflation higher, creating a vicious cycle that keeps rents on an upward trajectory. Yet, inflation is just the tip of the iceberg. There are even more significant determinants at work, closer to home than many renters realize. What about this? Lack of inventory. The United States faces a critical shortage of rental properties, with the most acute shortfall among affordable units. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, there's a deficit of around 7 million affordable homes for low-income renters alone. Now, this limited supply pushes renters into higher-priced units or longer commutes to their place of work. Here's another factor: higher mortgage rates. Now, mortgage rates have hit 20-year highs, making it more expensive for landlords and investors to finance properties. The impact? Well, landlords are simply passing these elevated financing costs down to tenants, leading to steeper rent hikes nationwide. The Federal Reserve's policies to curb inflation are only exacerbating this trend, making home financing and, by extension, renting costlier. What about barriers to home ownership? For many would-be homeowners, high home prices, competitive bidding wars, and rising mortgage interest rates make buying a home unfeasible. Now, this bottleneck keeps prospective homeowners in the rental market longer, increasing demand and driving up rents. Compounding this is the construction slowdown, of course, caused by supply chain disruptions and rising material costs of building. At the moment, the United States is short of roughly 4 million homes needed to meet demand. That's per data we got from Freddie Mac. What about expired rent freezes and discounts? Of course, during the pandemic, many urban areas saw temporary rent freezes and steep discounts as city dwellers moved out. But landlords have responded by aggressively raising prices on new leases and renewals, making up for their lost revenue. This effect has been particularly pronounced in cities that were hit hardest during the pandemic, where rents have rebounded past pre-pandemic levels. A shifting workforce. This is a factor as well, isn't it? Remote work has fundamentally altered housing demand. High-income remote workers have moved to previously affordable suburban and rural areas, pushing those rents up in markets that had once been more accessible. Zillow data has shown that rents in suburban areas rose by nearly 30% from 2020 to 2023, outpacing increases in many urban centers. More demand to live alone. This is a really important factor. More renters are now looking for one-bedroom and studio apartments. As lifestyle shifts, the desire for privacy drive the trend of solo living. With fewer roommates, more single occupancy demand, prices for smaller units have of course skyrocketed. In fact, according to Rent.com, rents for one-bedroom apartments have risen by an average of 10% in major U.S. cities over the past 12 months. But if you think these are the only reasons for the relentless climb in rent prices, think again. There's another powerful factor at play, one that threatens to push rents to new heights and create a perfect storm for renters across the nation. Have you guessed what that is yet? Property tax hikes and building maintenance costs. Oh yeah, as property taxes surge, particularly in high-demand areas, landlords find themselves facing higher annual expenses. Local governments, of course, they're grappling with budget shortfalls and increased service demands all the time. They've turned to property tax hikes to make up the difference. According to Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, property tax rates in some states have risen by as much as 15% since 2023. 15. And this increase directly, of course, impacts landlords' operating costs. Meanwhile, building maintenance expenses have also surged, driven by inflation in construction materials and labor costs. Essential repairs like HVAC servicing, roofing, and plumbing now cost significantly more than they did even a few years ago. The National Apartment Association highlights that maintenance costs per unit have risen by 20% year over year, putting millions of mom-and-pop landlords in a very tight spot. Well, for renters, this means shouldering the financial burden of rising property taxes and maintenance expenses, creating yet another obstacle in the struggle to find affordable housing. Now, I think another thing to consider is that wages are certainly rising slower than rents, which can make those payments feel even more expensive. Since 2019, rent prices have risen at a rate 1.5 times that of wages, and that's, according to Zillow analysts, 1.5 times that of wages. Okay, what's all this add up to? The answer isn't just more expensive rent, it's a rental crisis on the horizon. Here we are, faced with a rental market more brutal than ever. Many Americans are calling out decisions by landlords that have been passing on abusive rent hikes to their tenants, even as inflation continues to drive up the cost of essential goods and services. The economic outlook remains uncertain, yet the financial burden on renters only grows heavier. A recent study from Intuit Credit Karma reveals a bleak reality. Roughly 1/4 of American renters now say they can no longer afford their rent payments. About 1 in 5 even anticipate needing to move back in with family or friends. This squeeze has left many aspiring homeowners in a tight spot, with little hope of transitioning out of the rental market. It has become harder and harder for first-time buyers and the younger generations to buy and own a home, shares Brooks Merkel, realtor with Ansley Real Estate and Stowe Group, in an interview with Newsweek. He notes that although many would prefer to invest in their own mortgages, the down payments and the cash flow requirements are simply out of reach for most people, especially the younger generations. For residents like Rose McCluskey in Fayetteville, Arkansas, the lack of government regulations for rent adjustments has created a personal crisis, with rental prices in her area surging as much as 50 to 100% post-pandemic. McCluskey has seen her rent hit unbelievable highs recently, saying, "Where are families supposed to live, or single parents?" she questions, expressing her frustration with the lack of affordable housing options. She empathizes with landlords who struggled during the pandemic, but believes that larger property owners are using the situation to their advantage. So, rent is insane, she says, like flushing money down the party, she remarks. You aren't getting ahead. Beyond rising prices, McCluskey also faces neglect from landlords unwilling to maintain even essential utilities. In her case, a $300 rent hike after the pandemic felt like a betrayal, especially given her 13 loyal years as a tenant. People can't move up and buy a house, McCluskey laments. You can't save because rent is robbing you. The high rent is legal thievery. Landlords could help the poverty level in our town by not ripping off their renters, says McCluskey, who argues that new legislation is necessary to protect renters from financial exploitation. Others, like 71-year-old Polly de Cesare, face similar challenges. Her rent, initially $1,000 in 2021, rose by $323, a leap she attributes to greed on the landlord's part. Living on Social Security and disability benefits, de Cesare already struggles to keep up with these increases. Her roommate, who requires oxygen and constant care, complicates the prospect of finding a new place to live, saying, "I'm really nervous of living out of my car with 2 cats and a person who relies on oxygen whom I care for," she says, fearing an imminent loss of stability. Look, despite popular belief that sky-high rents are unique to major cities like New York, Los Angeles, the problem has infiltrated smaller towns as well. And as the financial pressure on renters continues to intensify, the question remains, is there anything you can do to soften the blow? Well, there is. Here is our advice for renters. Number 1, negotiate longer leases now to lock in current rates before prices rise further. You're never going to get them down. Stop them going up. A 1 or 2 year lease could offer some stability against looming increases. 2, consider relocating to areas with more stable rent trends. Smaller cities, suburban areas can sometimes offer more affordable options, so don't hesitate to explore different locations. 3, tap into renter assistance programs. Seek out local subsidies. Many cities and states have resources to support tenants facing these high costs, and these programs could help offset your rent. Now, I know this may not be the news anyone wants to hear, but as tough as this reality is, arming yourself with knowledge now can help you weather the storm. It may seem daunting, but remember, you're not alone in this struggle. Millions are navigating this same journey, and understanding what's coming is the first step to staying ahead. If this video provided you with valuable insights, or if you're feeling the pinch of rising rent prices, please give it a thumbs up. Share it with anyone who might be dealing with the same challenges, and don't forget to subscribe for regular updates, critical financial insights, and plenty of tips that could help you stay ahead of the curve. Thank you for watching.